thing at Knowsley Educational Psychology Service. So today I've been asked to come here to talk about getting to the cause of behaviour, looking at that relational and trauma-informed approach. So just a bit of an overview of what we're thinking of today is, first of all, we'll have a quick think about what behaviour is, what are we seeing in schools, have a think about what trauma is and how this may present itself as well, have a think about the science and the neuroscience behind why trauma informed and relational approaches work, what it is about them, and why everyone's talking about them. And then some of the feedback was that schools wanted some sort of practical strategies and examples. So I'm going to introduce a framework that I'm hoping that you've got something that you can go away with then and give a go and try, and you can help to sort of implement those strategies as we're thinking about trauma-informed and relational approaches. So just a quick bit of sort of general housekeeping as you do. Um, I know we've just been asked, but if you could all just sort of sign in on the chat if you like, so you name your role and the school or the setting that you're from or service, that's really helpful. Thank you. Um, I'm quite happy to answer questions, so if you want to ask anything, pop it in the chat box, and I'll try and sort of read it and get to you if there's anything. A big thing about this is I just want to be mindful that it is an introduction. We've got an hour here, and so behaviour, relational approaches and trauma, I do whole day trainings, 2-day trainings on each of these topics. So this is really a snapshot of those. Um, and so if there's anything, following today's session that you want to follow up on, please contact your educational psychology services. I'm sure they'd be happy to help. And the last bit is we are talking about some quite difficult subjects here today. And so I just want to sort of say, be kind to yourself. I know that sometimes these trainings can hit us a little bit, that maybe a little bit unexpectedly, or and so it's really important to just remember that self-care, and remember that self-care isn't selfish. It's so important to enable you to be the best person that you can be and to continue doing the jobs that you're doing. So if you need to take a little break from the training or anything like that, that's completely fine. Okay, so let's start with that big question. So what is behavior? So when I'm talking about behaviour is a really broad term, and it encompasses any observable actions or reactions. Now, it's not only sort of physical actions like walking, talking, eating, but also those internal mental processes as well, thinking, feeling, perceiving. And behaviour is shaped by a complex interplay of biological, social, psychological factors. And it's important to note that behaviour can be influenced by both conscious and unconscious factors. So conscious behaviours tend to be those more sort of deliberate actions that we choose to perform, but unconscious behaviours are those automatic response that often we might not be aware of or know why we're doing as well. And we as humans behave in certain ways in response to our thought, feelings, and behaviours. So some of you may be familiar with this cognitive triangle. But it's important to remember that that process happens within the context of our environment, but also our experiences as well. So although this pattern of thoughts, feelings, and behaviour is the same for everybody, the difference is in our experiences. And because the behaviour that we employ is influenced by our internal
Is it
working
live?
model. And these have been developed through our interactions with the world and what's been going on about us. And we also do them in response to the environment and the context that we're in. So,
See, that's our, this is
oh,
our,
I think
right.
someone's just got their mic on there, if you don't mind. Thank you. Sorry. Um, so some of the types of behaviors, I think, behaviors can be all those lovely things, those smilings, those laughings, helping others out when you're in need, all of those things. But I'm going to guess that we're more interested in trying to support some of those other behaviors that might be a little bit more difficult to manage in schools and in classrooms. And these can broadly be thought of in two main categories, if you like. We've got the externalizing behaviors. So these are things that are directed outwards, and they tend to be more noticeable. They tend to be things like aggression, impulsivity, hyperactivity, disruptive behavior, defiance, rule breaking, things like that. And then there's the internalizing ones, and these are often more tricky to identify, particularly in a busy classroom. You've got your eyes on 30 plus kids. Sometimes these can go a little bit under the radar, and
Passion, I mean.
that's because they're more those sort of depression. Maybe a child becomes more shy and withdrawn. Maybe it's that level of anxiety that's bubbling away there. Maybe it's those manifestations of also sort of psychological distress through physical symptoms. So when you've got the children that complain about having a stomach ache or feeling sick, or yeah, all of those different things. You often have children that say that their legs are really hurting on the way to school if they're feeling a bit nervous about going to school. All of those can be those sorts of behaviours. And of course, just to say, children are complex, and we don't sort of tend to clearly split into these two categories, but it's just a helpful way of thinking about it. Some children do express more externalizing, some more internalizing, but often it's a mixture of both. Um, so, thinking about the cause of behaviours, there is behavior is a really complex, multifaceted interplay of biological, psychological, social, and environmental factors. And so it's often hard for us to pin it down to very, very specific things, because you've got so much going on in a complex being. But you've got things like thoughts and emotions, your psychological factors, they're really crucial in shaping behavior, emotional states, cognitive processes, so a person's ability to attend, their memory, their decision-making skills, the way that they perceive and interpret the world. This can all lead us to have different behavioural responses. Our learned behaviours are really important. So some things become very habitual, they become automatic. Environmental factors, so our social engagements, our cultural, physical influences, physical environments as well. For example, a cluttered household or chaotic environment, this can lead to stress and anxiety in some people, and social interactions as well. And so what we know is this sort of more difficult or less desirable behaviour in children at school can stem from a variety of different factors. But often one of the causes is that difficulty in regulating emotions. So children may struggle with managing frustration, anger, sadness, leading to some of these bigger outbursts, those externalizing behaviours. Maybe it's those lack of social skills, so they may not know how to communicate effectively with their peers, leading to misunderstandings, and negative interactions with their peers, perhaps. Additionally, if a child is struggling within the classroom, they may get frustrated with their schoolwork and act in a way to avoid that schoolwork, or to save themselves from a feeling of embarrassment if they don't feel like they can meet those expected needs, even if we as teachers think that they can. And there's also those externalizing factors like family stress, trauma, and any upheaval in life, big changes, things like that. I know Christmas in particular is often a time, it's a wonderful time, but it's also can be a time that can cause quite a lot of anxiety for our young ones, particularly those that don't like change, because all of a sudden our environment is lit up in brightly coloured lights and there's lots of sensory input, and routines change, things like that. So um, the other big thing is trauma and adversity, which is what I've been asked to come and speak to you today about. And so I just want to take a bit of time to think about trauma. And I think it's important to highlight that it's extremely complex, and there's many different types of trauma. There's lots of different definitions. So this is just a bit of a summary to provide a bit of an overview. So in a snapshot, trauma can be described as an emotional response to a stressful, frightening, and distressing event. It can be experienced, it can be witnessed or confronted. It can include things like racism, generational trauma, community violence. Um, it could be a single event, or it could be a sustained period of toxic stress over days, weeks, or years. If you're interested in toxic stress, I'm not going to have time to really go into it here, but please ask your EP service because it is extremely important to understand, and it does contribute to all of this. Um, I will be sort of talking about it as we go through, but um, then there's adversity during childhood, and this typically impacts on typical development. Sorry. So the impact it has depends on loads of different factors. So it can depend on the age of the child, when it happened. But an important one is resources and support that is available um, when trauma is a present, and that helps us sort of, if there's a lot of support available, it generally helps us process, manage, and it will impact on how that trauma presents in the child. Because the thing is, danger is a universal event for humans. We all come across danger, but trauma is a response to that. So not everyone will experience trauma from the same degree, from the same danger. So myself and someone else could be in exactly the same event, and the way we process that would be very, very different depending on our experiences, our interpretation of the world, all of these different things. So a child may experience adverse events, but if they have protective factors in place, this allows them to manage the situation, perhaps without developing a trauma response. Other children, however, may not have so many protective factors, leading to a lot of difficulties that us as professionals need to support with. Other children, that trauma, that event may be so big that it overrides some of those supportive factors. It's all a very complex mixture. But it's important to have a think about sort of the impact of trauma on what we call typical development, if you like. So trauma can impact on things like sensory development, attachment, emotional and behavioral regulation, cognition and learning, attention, concentration, and it can also have a really big impact on a young person's development of their identity, their sense of self, and their idea of whether they believe they are worthy of love and care. It can have a big impact on those sorts of things. So a nice way, well, a good quote that I like when thinking about trauma is this one from Gabor Mate. He writes the sort of Scattered Minds and the Myth of Normal books that are good. But it's the idea that um, your body responds to that event. Oh, sorry, I think we, yeah. That means that it's how your body responds to the event. So trauma is not necessarily what happens to you, but it's what happens inside of you. There's another quote by Bessel van der Kolk, who says that trauma is not just an event that took place in the past. It is also the imprint left by that experience on the mind, the brain, and the body. This imprint has ongoing consequences for how the human organism manages to survive in the present. So it's that idea that it's not just the event, it's that ongoing sort of ripple effect, if you like. So when I was thinking about how trauma can sort of present in school, I'm going to draw from something that I think a lot of you will be familiar with, the fight, fright, freeze. Sorry. Some of you may be less familiar with the fawn, and I'll come to that, don't worry. But often, what are we seeing? We often see a fight, flight, freeze, fawn response. And think about those externalizing and internalizing behaviors. They tend to roughly fit into these four areas. Um, and that's because these are survival responses. So they've literally kept us alive at some point in human history, but also still to this day, these are the responses that, make you walk a little bit faster when you're in the dark, or make you jump out the road when you go to cross it and you didn't see the car coming. We still rely on them to this day. And individuals may exhibit a combination of these responses, but it's important to note we don't fit into boxes, and we tend to shift between them depending on the nature of the trauma, personal history, and context of the situation as well. These are unconscious responses, they're not choices. And sometimes we can, build up our resilience and have a little bit of influence on them, but they're such strong responses because they've had to be, because they are survival responses. So as teachers, as people interacting with our young people, we need to recognise when our children are in survival mode. And often the easiest way of doing this is sort of recognising when perhaps a child's response doesn't necessarily match the intensity of the stressor, or when behaviors can be a little bit confusing or hard to explain, because often it's because there are these survival responses. So what do these specifically look like? I think you'll all be familiar with, obviously, fight. We've got those quite externalizing behaviors, the shouting, it may be arguing back, it may be hitting out, aggression, it could be knocking things off a desk. Those quite physical things. It's that surge of adrenaline that needs to be released some way, and sort of meeting fire with fire, if you like. Then we've got the flight, which is often restlessness. It can be fidgeting, wandering off, walking away, hiding. We get a lot of young people that will walk out of lessons or walk away from the adult. We've got the freeze response. So this can often look like young people being very unresponsive. Maybe they're refusing to engage with an adult, refusing to speak or do anything. But it's also that avoiding eye contact, daydreaming, might be shutting down. They might be the young person that people are like, oh, they're always in their own world, they're always in their own bubble. That might be a sign that they're in that free. It might also be a sign they've got a wonderful imagination, but it could be a sign that they're in that freeze state. And then we've got the fawn, which some of you might be less familiar with. And this is the survival mechanism where you are trying to befriend the threat. You're trying to appease the lion in front of you, if you like. So this is where you've got kids where they often sort of follow blindly with what their friends are doing. They might smile or laugh at you when you're telling them off, which I know as an adult can be quite aggravating, but it sometimes is their response to try and sort of appease a threat. Um, it's This is particularly evident in teenagers, as the influence of peers grows massively. We tend to see young people sort of following their friends, that whole phrase of, well, would you jump off a cliff if someone else did? It's that, following along with what their peers are doing, even if sometimes they know it's perhaps not what they should be doing or what they want to do, but they can't seem to break free of that. So you might see any of these sorts of behaviors as a result of the fight, flight, freeze response. So where what produces this fight, flight, freeze response? So the neuroscience behind this, and behind sort of a trauma response. So the neurosequential model, the basics of it is that the human brain develops from a bottom-up approach, so a sequential approach. So, and that the human brain needs all these three regions to develop, and ensure healthy emotional, social, and cognitive regulation. So in this model, the brainstem develops first. So that's that orange bit in the middle, and it develops during pregnancy. Its main role is sensory and motor input, biological and psychological survival. So it's a key stress pathway, and it's very fast at processing external and internal sensory regulation, sensory information. It's like an alarm system. So, um, and this is why, when we see a fetus or a newborn, very young children, this is why experiences that they have can have such a big impact on sort of their functioning and responsiveness. Following this, we have the development of the limbic system. This is the second area, and this includes the amygdala, which main role is managing those emotions, our attachment systems, so developing those relationships. And then the last area to develop is that cortical brain. So that's our thinking, learning, and planning brain. And just to put this there, the cortex does not become fully organized until we are in our mid to late 20s. So it's a long, long journey for that part of the brain to develop and become our main go-to over the other two bits. Um, and so we need, in order to have that top part of that thinking logic brain, we need the other two to be regulated. So I don't know if anyone's familiar with Dan Siegel's hand model. That's why I keep doing this if you're looking at me. It's the idea that we've got our brainstem here, we've got the thumb, which is the amygdala, the limbic brain, so that's our emotional development and relationships, and then we've got the top part, which is our thinking logic brain. And the idea is that when we're regulated, our fist forms a brain, so it looks like that. And but when a child is in survival mode, they flip their lid. So this logical thinking part of the brain comes offline. The communication between the two parts is down. And in order to re-engage, discuss an event logically, and to learn from that situation, we need to regulate the system to ensure that logical thinking brain can come back online. And that's because there's sort of two routes to send information to the amygdala. So one is that slower route, or the higher road, as some models call it. And it's that when the information moves through the cortex, so it sifts through the information that it's getting, it reasons, it reflects, and then it informs the amygdala in a calm and rational way, which produces the behaviour. The second one bypasses this, and the incoming streams of perceptions are sent directly to the amygdala to make a split-second reaction. And often this results in mostly this results in a higher emotional response because it's not had a chance to be reasoned and diluted by that thinking brain. Now, what's important here is that those who have experienced trauma will have much more need to use that quicker route. That will be much more established, and it will be much more unconsciously favoured, which is why we sometimes see a lot more sort of emotional reactions, if you like, from young people who have experienced trauma. Um, just to say, if anyone's interested and wants to look into any more of this, Beacon House has some fantastic resources, and there's some references throughout as I talk about these various models, and I've got a reference list at the end as well. The other model that I think is really helpful and interesting to understand the link between our emotions and how our body responds, and how this is related to trauma and our behaviour, is the polyvagal theory. And we talk about this often as the window of tolerance. And so this is the idea that our nervous system is constantly making assessments about whether our environment is safe. When we're in this window of tolerance, at that green middle bit, we can think, learn, love, empathize, relax, explore, and reflect. And difficult times can take us to the edge, or it can take us into that dysregulation. But our own regulation strategies can bring us back. So if our system detects a threat and we go out of this window of tolerance, this can result in hyper or hypoarousal. And once we're pushed out, we can flip sort of back and forth between hyper and hypoarousal. But what's important to note is when we are pushed out of this window of tolerance, that thinking logical brain, that top part goes offline. So our lid's flipped. It gets disconnected. And what's important to note here is that there are actually neurochemical changes that swing into the brainstem. So in short, we need to ensure that children are brought back to that window of tolerance before a problem can be sort of logically dealt with. So for some, the window of tolerance may be narrower than those who have had a really secure and stable developmental period. So where a child or young person has experienced perhaps repeated traumas or toxic stress, long-term traumas or adverse childhood experiences, there can be long-term changes in the way that the brain responds to stressful situations. So the amygdala can increase in size and become over-responsive. It means that the brain can view situations as more dangerous or threatening than perhaps they are, and the stress response is triggered more often. And when this happens, it's very difficult for that person to control their actions and emotions. So children may go out of their window of tolerance without sort of provocation. They may remain out of it for longer. They may be stuck there without being able to regulate themselves. Um, and that's because the part of the brain that helps us tell the difference between past memories and what is happening can be smaller as well. And further changes mean that it makes it harder to regulate our thoughts and emotions, so we can have stronger than expected emotional responses. So often children and young people need adults to help them move back into their window of tolerance to help them co-regulate. A helpful analogy of sort of the window of tolerance and this sort of alarm system or survival mechanism is one that, say if I moved into a house and there was fires starting up left, right, and centre. I had faulty wiring, really bad electrics, and they just kept sparking up. So I'd be minding my own business and it would spontaneously set on fire. If that was the case, you would invest in the best fire alarm system that you could possibly find. You'd have the most sensitive smoke detectors, heat detectors, the loudest alarm in the world, and you'd have sprinklers to put out the fire. And all of that would be done to keep you safe. But then imagine if I moved house because my house was always setting on fire and it's, not a great house. I'd like to go somewhere else. So I move house, but I've obviously spent a lot of time, energy, and probably money in developing this really sensitive fire alarm system, and years getting it to work just right for me. So when I move to my new house, I take that with me. But my new house doesn't set on fire all the time. It's up to building regs, but my super sensitive alarm system is still with me. So that means that maybe I'm just, using the toaster and my toast gets a little bit burnt and it trips the alarm system. Everybody panics, sprinklers everywhere, everyone gets wet. So it goes off from a tiny bit of smoke or heat because that alarm system is designed to keep me safe. And even though I've moved somewhere safer, the alarm system is just doing its job. And I think it's quite a nice analogy because this is what happens to some of our kids who have experienced trauma or negative life experiences. They develop this really sensitive system that keeps them safe, but it means that their window of tolerance is smaller because they've needed that in the past. But it doesn't automatically get switched off when they're in a safe environment. So they are attuned to possible threats, which can set the whole system off from what we might perceive as a smaller, minor trigger, because it thinks it's keeping them safe and their body doesn't know any different. So, um, so what you might be familiar with as well is this assault curve. So what can happen is when a child goes out of their window of tolerance, we can very quickly see them go into crisis phase. And often there will be we often use the phrase of 0 to 100, don't we? But often there are small, everyday things that are dripping away that are those triggers, and they build up and up until something happens and we end up in that crisis phase. But when we're in that crisis phase, our body provides a real physiological response. It's that fight, fright, freeze. Um, and we have to make that decision. Do we stick around and try and fight off these feelings, or do we avoid them by fleeing the situation? Regardless of which, our body gets ready to act by increasing our heart rate, so our muscles work faster, producing cortisol and adrenaline to increase our awareness of everything going on. And these are natural responses to the stimuli, and experiences within short term that have been essential to survival. It's our sympathetic nervous system. So when a survival response is triggered and they move out of this window of tolerance, they will move through that emotional arousal or assault cycle. And then we need quite a long time to come back down and to regulate. And then you'll see that we end up with this post-crisis sort of depression phase, because that phase uses an awful lot of energy. And because we are back in that regulated state, we can then slip into that depressive state afterwards. So, how does a child read the environment? So our nervous systems scan for cues of safety and danger within our environment without us even being aware. And this is called neuroception. So we all do this, and it's an automatic nervous system response. We're constantly scanning our environment. So if this was in-person training, for example, you will have all engaged with this as like when you came in the room. So imagine you come into a training room and you will have scanned a new room if it's unfamiliar to you. You'll know where the exits are, even if it's subconsciously. You'll have chosen your seat depending on who else is in the room. And what I often think is quite interesting is training often fills up from the back. because the trainer, the person at the front, is often that unknown person who could be the threat. So we want to put a bit of distance. But that is all that neuroception and making those decisions based on sort of the feeling of the room, what's going on. You know, if you walk in and I'm feeling quite calm and I'm smiling at you, you might feel more confident to come and sit at the front and have a little chat with me. But if there's lots and lots going on, you might not. And in the classroom, it's the same. So cues of safety and danger in a classroom can largely be split up to these two groups. So interpersonal cues and environmental ones. So as I said, greetings are huge. They start off the student's whole experience in your classroom. So, you know, those first questions, the first greetings, are they coming in, seeing you smiling, showing that you're safe, or perhaps your back's turned so they're not quite sure what mood you're in. Facial expressions, simple ones, like smiling. There's actually some interesting research that shows that the eye crinkles that some people have um, actively lead us to relax. Um, so, you know, after all those years of getting those crinkles, that they are can be a positive. Tone of voice is huge as well. So children who have experienced trauma may be sort of sensitive to these sounds, and it may tap into that evolutionary cue. You know, those loud, low frequencies, they can be processed almost like that predator sound, and they can make us panic. Um, and you know, environmental, is it a small classroom? Are they sat opposite a peer in their direct eye gaze, meaning that they cannot move away from this sort of threat of social judgment, if you like, and being watched? Is the temperature too hot? All of these different things. Is there a lot of noise going on? Um, so how do we help? This is the key question, isn't it? So trauma-informed focus, sorry, so this is where trauma-informed and relational approach comes involved. So a trauma-informed focus focuses on understanding how trauma affects learning, behavior, and emotional and relationships. So it focuses on creating physical and psychological safety for our students, and it's that regulation before instruction. A relational approach in school focuses on building high quality, trusting relationships as a foundation for learning and behaviour. So, relationships at the centre, with co regulating adults and belonging and community being really, really important. Um, a trauma informed school must be a relational school. So if you're doing one, you're probably well on your way to the other. But if we put these together, it creates a school environment where students feel both safe and contained, which are both things that they need for learning and well-being. So it's this quote of relationships are the agents of change, because they really are the crux of it all. By sort of thinking about and raising our awareness of complex emotions and what it means to be human, and for each individual, we are supporting our young people, because learning is an interpersonal process. So our relationships impact on academic development and their wider learning and development. Um, so if we go back to the first thing of how a child sort of scans the room, there are some simple tweaks that we can put in place, starting with the environment. So you might be sick to death of hearing these sorts of things, so I do apologise, but you cannot underestimate them, and so I do have to sort of go over them. Um, but they can be really easy wins if you think about that child walking in. So as we've already talked about, the welcome, you know, do they see you really busy and sort of chaotic, or do you pull them straight away for their uniform or something they did, you know, at break time, or are you standing calmly and providing that gentle eye contact, that smile? Do you have a clear, predictable structure for your lessons? Do you have consistent boundaries that are presented in a nurturing way? So we can be emotionally responsive, but clear about what the expectations are at the same time. So things like, I know it's hard to shout out, but we put our hands up in this classroom. Those sorts of things. You know, does it set the tone for a calm, regulated lesson? So could you perhaps add some calming music as the children come in from break time? Those sorts of things are quite little tweaks that I think we underestimate, but actually can have a really big impact. Things like, is your classroom quite well visually well organized, or is it quite chaotic and cluttered, and don't get me wrong, I completely get it, and my desk is really cluttered, but it can impact on our stress response. All of those different things. The community versus individual is a really interesting one as well. And this goes from the school ethos, but also those things that you do in the classroom. So do you do like class chanting or call and responses? Do you have like a class recognition goal that you're all working towards, as well as, or instead of those individual sort of house points or whatever it is you do in your school? All of those sorts of things can help us to work towards feeling safe and secure and part of the whole. And then we're on to relationships. So this is a quote paraphrased from the Secondary Behaviour Cookbook, because I think it applies to both secondary and primary, but it is that idea that relationships are foster that learning climate. So I know when the pressure is on to raise attainment, achieve targets, and evidence progress, the focus on relationships can sometimes feel a little bit frustrating. But through all strategies, interventions, and learning tasks, they all take place within a complex web of relationships. We can't get away from it. We are social beings. Our world is socially constructed. So paying attention to these relationships promotes that positive and nurturing relationship. And it doesn't detract from the academics, it actually enhances it instead. So there's just some quick sort of strategies that that are low on resource that you could pop in place. So, and these are really, really powerful things. So connecting comments are massive. So we often get stuck in those cycles of negative comments. We all do it. We overcorrect, particularly when a child continuously struggles. We're often ready and primed to say, don't do that, or, oh, and comment on that. Um, but it's important to highlight those positives, even if it's the small things. And the ratio should be about 3 to 1. So we call them connecting comments, but positive comments, whatever it is. And this is because it's so much easier to listen to a correcting comment if you believe the person that is delivering it can see the good in you and believes that you can engage with that correction. They see that positive that goes on and how hard you try. Um, Sometimes we need to plan these. In fact, I recommend, spending a bit of time and brainstorming some. I've had teachers that stick them up in their drawers or their cupboards, when they need a little bit of a, what can I say that's positive when they're having a particularly bad day. But they really do make a difference. You've got the 2 for 10 approach, and this is, research based, and it's the idea that you taking time to have a 2 minute genuine conversation with a pupil for 10 days straight really strengthens that relationship. So, give it a go and see what happens. And then there's a PACE approach, which is a way of thinking, feeling, and communicating that aims to make children and young people feel safe. So it stands for playfulness, acceptance, curiosity, and empathy. And it's about putting these throughout all your interactions. So when I say playfulness, I don't necessarily mean playing a game with them. That can be in the way that we interact with them, using some humour, some supportive, some friendly approaches, things like that. If you want more information on that, again, there's lots and lots online, or you can ask your EP service. So just coming back to some of these behaviours, particularly these externalizing behaviours. What do we do when a child is in that sort of crisis scenario, when they're really, really struggling? How do we regulate them to support them to come back down and to address such behaviours and move out of those survival responses? This is where our brain model comes in. So the regulate, relate, reason model is really helpful, and it maps onto that neurosequential model. It uses our knowledge of brain development and brain chemistry to help children in their emotions and actions. So when we're faced with a young person that's exhibiting disruptive behaviour, emotional dysregulation, it's often our response to jump straight to logic, explaining why their behaviour is inappropriate, or making demands, or laying out consequences. However, if a child is in a state of hyper or hypoarousal, moving into that fight, flight, freeze response, then their brains and their bodies jump to that basic survival mode. They react instinctively, driven by adrenaline and cortisol. And we know their logical thinking brain has gone offline. And again, that's that part that processes language as well. So they're probably not able to process what you're saying within that moment. So the first stage is regulating them back into their window of tolerance. And I think, it's using that bottom up approach and following that sequence, which is all about those brainstem activities, which we'll come on to. And then they'll be able to better reason and engage in those cortical activities or those problem solvings. So if we violate the sequence or we do it out of order, for example, it's unlikely that that thinking brain's going to come back online. And this is where we need the hidden fourth R that I like to add, which is repair, which we can come to. What's interesting here is what we like about this model is that most interventions, sort of targeted interventions, use a top-down approach. So if you think about sort of our therapies and counselling, CBT, for example, which is brilliant, but it's literally cognitive behavioural therapy. It targets that cognitive part. And, we need children to be calm and ready to think about this. And it takes time. And also, as busy teachers, we're not therapists as well. So we need a model that we can put in place that goes from that bottom up. So regulate, relate, reason. So it fits in line with this brain development. Oh, there's a nice visual for it. So the first step of this is our regulate. So what is it? It's a way from moving from alarming to calming. So a way of calming those fight, flight, freeze form response. In other words, it's a way of gaining sort of a bit of control over their emotions. So the way we do this is when a child's survival mechanism is activated and they come out of their window of tolerance, it has a chain reaction of physical responses. So the adrenaline, heartbeat, and so the opposite of that survival response is the vagal nerve or the parasympathetic nervous system. And this is responsible for returning the body back to a normal level of functioning. So good vagal tone allows for faster responses due to faster processing information. And it allows you to calm their responses and regulate and return to sort of normal more quickly. If you think of it like a muscle, those neural pathways are stronger. And both the environment and genetics play a role in that. Now, we can't impact the genetics, but we can impact the environment and our responses as well. And kids learn to regulate themselves over time through modeling and examples from adults. So first they require adults to co-regulate, and then over time they learn what works for them. And co-regulating occurs when one person can transmit a sense of safety, trust, and comfort to another. And it's done by being reliably and consistent and present throughout, and a lot of the time through our nonverbal communication. So how do we do that? Because it's easier said than done, I think. First step first, regulating yourself. And that is because an escalated person cannot de-escalate another person. You can't fight fire with fire. So we need to be aware of our own triggers. Once a child has drawn you into an argument, they're in control of that there. We are social creatures. So if you raise your voice, they're going to match that. They're going to raise their voice to match it. Whereas if you stay calm, it's much easier for them to come down to meet you. So this often means calming your own body, whatever that looks like, taking deep breaths, maybe you need a little break, things like that, and being aware of your own sort of triggers and warnings, because then we're able to be much more in control. So it's staying in the moment and focusing your attention. A big part of this is around school ethos, because for staff to feel able to do this, they need to feel cared and supported, and they need to feel regulated within their school environment as well. If staff don't feel emotionally safe, the children won't either. So one really helpful way is sort of formalizing circles of support. So having each adult have, a pair or a group where if they're really struggling and they might need a break, they can call on them. And oftentimes they don't use these other people because they're able to manage the situation themselves, but the knowledge of having that almost out for them can be really, really emotionally containing and supportive. So once we've calmed ourselves and we're regulated, or we're faking it until we make it, how do we regulate the young person? So regulating through our interpersonal responses is a really important part. So we're sending safety cues. So eye gaze, facial expressions, body language, conveying calmness. Because what we have to remember is the calm voice of the adult becomes the internalized voice the child hears. But similarly, if an adult is shouting, that becomes the internalized voice. So we want it to be calm. In the early stages, use humor, distraction to diffuse that situation, use a connecting comment, um, provide them with take up time. So ask them to do something or say something that's going to happen and then just walk away, remove that direct contact conflict and carry on with the lesson, come back to them at a later point. Be mindful of your body position. If you're an adult and they're a child and you're sort of leaning over them, that can be quite intimidating. If you're standing between them and the door, if you're using the hands a lot, perhaps pointing, all of those things can be a little bit threatening without meaning to be. Um, Avoid questions like what's wrong, and instead validate how they're feeling. So you can label, or I think you're feeling a little bit frustrated at the moment. And remember those mirror neurons. So that is, they activate when someone else is performing an action. And these are neurons that would then be used when we perform that action on self, making it easier. So if you model that calmness, they will. So it's that idea of when they turn up, so when they start shouting, you turn down. So you go lower verbal communication, less of it, slower, more subtle movements, reassurance, very much so. So you're balancing that out for them. And regulating through activities. So providing physical activities. So allowing movement, so releasing some of that adrenaline that's built up. So in those early stages, that might be getting them to hand out books, going for a walk, those resistant bands, things like that are all really helpful. Engaging in repetitive organizing or like tasks that are familiar and easy, that really helps to soothe ourselves and help that thinking brain come back online. Things like sorting out the pencils into colours or uh, as I say, handing out those books, something that isn't too sort of demanding on them, that they can help them regulate. Sometimes having a drink or something to eat helps pause. I had a young person who found that they had a big bag of carrot sticks, and when they got frustrated, they'd munch through a little carrot stick, and they just needed 10 seconds to do that, and that really helped them regulate. Another young person that would have a strong mint because it sort of awoken their senses and helped them come back into that room. Playing sort of easy, familiar games, grounding, deep breathing, all of those things are really, really regulating activities that are really helpful. Then we move on to the stage. So this is our ability to connect with others. It's about sitting in the emotions with them, like sadness does in this clip of Inside Out. It's about, understanding and supporting them there. So this quote is quite a nice one, I think. And this is that idea that, think back to the last time you had a really rubbish, tough day at work. You probably went home, and if your partner's anything like mine, like you tried to rant to your partner and they might have tried to fix that and said, oh, why didn't you do this, or maybe you should do that. And that can sometimes be a little bit frustrating, and because it's not what we need time to be heard and understood before we can move on to that problem solving stage. And that's what a child needs as well. They need an adult to be a container for their emotions. It means that you're alongside them and you know and accept what they're feeling, so they don't feel as overwhelmed and isolated with it. This is where those phrases such as connection before correction, rapport before reason comes in. And as we've talked about, this is all that pre-planning, that preemptive stuff, because the stronger your relationships are to start with, the easier this process will be. And a big way is to make them feel seen, heard, and understood and safe. So speaking softly, helping them label emotions, I know you're angry at the minute. I'm listening. I can see you're really upset. I can see that you're frowning and kicking the wall. I can see you've got loads of energy, built up. I notice you looking around at other people's work. I wonder if you might be feeling a bit nervous at the moment, that your work isn't okay. Depending on their developmental stage, their language level will depend on how you would tailor these types of things. But again, avoid that sort of what's wrong, because a lot of children won't be able to answer that. They'll really struggle to answer that. And so sometimes we need to support them on their way to that instead, and those first stages. Another helpful sort of framework is emotion coaching. And that so there's two in green, and that's because they fit into this connection part, and then the two in pink move on to that reasoning stage that we're going to come to next. But emotion coaching is an evidence-based approach which highlights that nurturing emotionally responsive relationships are an optimum time for developing that emotional literacy and resilience. So it's that first stage of recognizing the child's feeling and empathizing. So we use all we know about our trauma-informed approach, so what we know about trauma and the impact that can have, to empathize with our young person, and then we validate and label the child's feelings. There are no wrong feelings. Anger, sadness, they're often painted out as negative, but they're really, really helpful feelings. Anxiety is a really helpful and key feeling. It helps us perform well in tests. It helps us, me today, practice my presentation before I come to you. It helps us to perform, but it's when it gets to that high level of stage that it becomes maladaptive. So it's important that we're validating, labeling, and saying it's okay to be angry about this, and then supporting them to manage those feelings and find ways to deal with them. Then we move on to the reasoning approach, which I'll come to next, which is those setting limits on behaviour if necessary, and problem solving. Again, there's whole training on emotion coaching, which is a really helpful framework for schools to put in place. Oh, gone too far. So then we get to the reasoning, and it's really important that this is only done when we're calm, and this helps them to think it through. So it requires our thinking brain. So if we're dysregulated, we're not going to be able to engage with this appropriately and effectively. So what we do is, in this moment, once we are calm and regulated, we want to explore what happened. So this isn't necessarily asking why they did something, because they often won't know, but it's about developmentally appropriately exploring that emotion. So can you tell me what happened? Have you felt that way before? Those sorts of conversations we need to be happening. Remember to keep validating in this. Oh yeah, that would make me really frustrated too. All of those sorts of things. Then if they need to, educate, provide information on why you think it might have happened, how it affected others. Set limits if they need to. We don't always need those formal consequences. Sometimes the fact that it's happened is enough for them to want to learn and to move on from that. And then scaffold, invite the young person to engage in creative problem solving, developing ideas and actions. So let's think of what we could have done instead. I can help you think of some different ways. Remember to acknowledge each other's wants and motivations in this situation. It's really important that we keep you safe. So how can we, put something in place to make sure that when you need a break, you're safe instead of running out the classroom, for example. And empower the child, so that you communicate that you believe in them to put these things in place. And if this sequence is followed and modelled, it'll help us to communicate effectively and support them to reflect and learn. I'm just coming to the end now because I know we're very much up against time. Um, the idea is, the long-term goal of this is, it's not going to be a big tidal wave, a big change overnight. It's a drip, drip, drip approach. And that's because every time we have these repeated experiences of regulating, relating, and reasoning, it is creating a stronger neurological pathway. That's meaning that they'll be able to access that logical thinking brain quicker each time. It may only be by nanoseconds, but they will be getting that and developing that. That's how we do that. So in the long term, we're aiming for them to sort of recognize when they're climbing that assault curve. We're looking for them to be able to recognize their emotions and also put in place some strategies. Um, and then the last
Don't
one,
feel,
just
Hannah, don't feel
yeah.
you need to rush yourself. Sorry.
Okay, wonderful. Don't want to keep everyone. It's late, isn't it? Um, so then I'm just going to touch on the repair. And that's the idea that sometimes, we are human. We don't always get it right. Child and adult, we are not perfect, and that is okay. Relationships have ups and downs, and a student needs to know they can come into your classroom next lesson, and they're not going to be sort of penalised or punished or picked on because of the mistakes they've made. So if you think about it, if you know you've fallen out with someone, perhaps if you think back to when you were at school and the next time you had to see them, you were probably quite emotionally aroused. You were probably quite nervous the next time seeing them. But a simple smile and those sorts of relational gestures really make a difference. So because ultimately we want a child to come into school because this helps them, yes, with their well-being, but also to learn more effectively. And all relationships are subject to rupture at times, which is why it's important to repair. So, as the adult in that situation, we need to sometimes take responsibility and say, you know what, sorry, I shouted in that moment. Like that wasn't okay. Let's have a think about how we can make that whole situation better. Um, you held that control in your classroom, so you set that tone. For some, this can be really simple, an ending comment of like, oh, I know you've got this. I know you're working really, really hard on this. That's enough. A smile, a laugh, a joke to break that tension after you've had that problem solving conversation. For others, particularly those that struggle with social understanding or have mistrust in adults, there might need to be some more explicit work around that. Um, and as you try this approach, there will be mistakes and you'll need to go back to regulation. Sometimes we bounce, that's okay. The more you practice, the more these things become much more natural. And if something goes wrong, that's fine. We can repair that. We can make that effort to repair. So, just coming to the last few points of this, in that what we need to remember is when a child loses control, for want of a better term. Oh, can't really see the end of those words, but it's the idea that we need to solve that moment first and solve the problem later. So it's not that we're letting a child get away with things, we are helping to de-escalate and we are helping to wait until that logic thinking brain is back online, because that is when the optimal teaching and the optimal time to manage to sort of learn and move on from that situation is. So in that moment, we want to keep everybody safe, remove any audience if we need to, enlist support if we need to, and other adults through those sort of helpful circle of adults and support, and come to those, make time for some children as well. As you move through this process, those problem solving conversations will become quicker and quicker. So you'll have a couple of children where you're like, oh, I'll be having these conversations so much. You will, but initially, and over time, that will reduce, and they will develop, and they will start to learn um, that one, how to engage in problem solving conversations, and two, start to recognize their emotions and stop them climbing so much. So when they're in this crisis phase, it's not quite the crisis it maybe once was. So, this is the regulate, relate, reason approach that hopefully, we can have a quick think about some of those quick wins for our environment, but then also next time something happens, maybe have a little think about this. I always find it's useful to print it out and just have it up in the classroom just to give ourselves a little bit of a reminder. Um, and we need to remember that sometimes spending 2 to 3 minutes with a pupil will save you time in the long run. So it might save you that big 10-minute, half an hour disruption later on down the road, or filling out an instant form or whatever it is that we do. So um, that I think is it from me. So if there's any questions at all, I'm more than happy to take. My email's at the bottom there, so please feel free to contact me. There's also just a list of references and further reading if anyone's interested. So that Dan Siegel one is around the brain the hand-brain model, emotion coaching, things like that. Yeah, so that's all from me. Thank you so much for listening. Ooh, right on past I've got.
And hopefully Helen's going to stop the recording now.